Ever wonder why your neighbor's tomato plants are loaded with fruit while yours look like a jungle, with barely any tomatoes to show for it? You're not alone. After 30 years of growing tomatoes, I've learned that getting tons of fruit instead of tons of leaves comes down to understanding a few key principles that most gardeners never learn. In this video, I'm going to show you the complete process, from selecting the right varieties to my secret calcium Epsom salt trick that can double your fruit production. And trust me, once you see the difference these techniques make, you'll never grow tomatoes the old way again. So let's jump right in. Growing tons of tomatoes instead of just leaves isn't about luck. It's about understanding what triggers fruit production versus vegetative growth. When you know how to control these triggers, you can literally steer your plants toward producing more fruit. And the best part? It's actually easier than trying to manage those wild, overgrown plants that produce disappointingly few tomatoes. Before we dive into the specific steps, let's understand why tomatoes sometimes go crazy with leaf production. You see, tomatoes are programmed to grow and reproduce, but they're also opportunists. When they sense lots of nitrogen in the soil, especially, they think great perfect conditions to grow big and strong, and they put all their energy into leaves and stems. It's like feeding a teenager nothing but protein shakes. They'll grow, sure, but not necessarily in the way you want. The same thing happens when tomatoes get too much shade or inconsistent care. They panic and go into survival mode, which means more green growth to capture more sunlight, not fruit production. Now, fruit production, on the other hand, gets triggered by slightly different conditions. Tomatoes want to make fruit when they sense that conditions are good, but not perfect. A little bit of stress, the right nutrients and proper sunlight actually push them into reproductive mode. Think about it from the plant's perspective. If life is too easy, why rush to make seeds? But if there's just a touch of urgency, that's when the magic happens. I learned this the hard way about 15 years ago, when I had the most beautiful tomato plants you'd ever seen. 8 feet tall, gorgeous green leaves, looked like something from a magazine. Problem was, I got maybe a dozen tomatoes from 6 plants that entire summer. My neighbor, whose plants looked almost scraggly compared to mine, was bringing me bags of tomatoes because she had too many. That's when I started researching what I was doing wrong. So let's start with step 1, selecting the right varieties and preparing your site, because this is where most people unknowingly set themselves up for leafy plants instead of fruitful ones. First off, variety selection matters more than you might think. Indeterminate varieties, which keep growing all season long, are actually more prone to the all leaves no fruit problem if they're not managed properly. But here's the thing. They also have the potential to produce the most fruit if you know what you're doing. I grow mostly indeterminates now. Varieties like Cherokee Purple, Brandywine, and San Marzano. Because once you learn to control them, they're fruit-producing machines. Determinate varieties, on the other hand, are more foolproof. They grow to a certain size, set all their fruit at once, and then they're done. Roma is a classic determinate, and if you're in zones 5 through 7 and want a guaranteed harvest without much fuss, throw in a few Roma plants. They're almost impossible to mess up. But here's what nobody tells you about variety selection. Disease resistance is directly connected to fruit production. A plant fighting off disease isn't making fruit. So in humid climates, you absolutely need to look for varieties with disease resistance. Look for those letters after the variety name. VFN means resistance to verticillium, fusarium, and nematodes. VFNT adds tobacco mosaic virus resistance. These might not be the heirloom varieties you dream about, but you know what? I'd rather have 50 pounds of good tomatoes than 5 pounds of perfect heirlooms. Now let's talk about site preparation, and this is where I see people make their biggest mistake. They add too much compost or manure, thinking they're doing their plants a favor. Here's what I do instead. and my tomato plants are loaded every year. First, I choose the sunniest spot in my garden, and I mean the absolute sunniest. Tomatoes need at least 8 hours of direct sun for maximum fruit production. 6 hours and you'll get leaves. 8 to 10 hours and you'll get fruit. It's that simple. My tomato bed gets sun from 7 a.m. to about 5 p.m., with a little break around noon when the oak tree provides some filtered shade, and that's perfect. The soil preparation is where I go against conventional wisdom. Instead of adding lots of rich compost, I actually add about 1/3 less than I would for other vegetables. My mix is 1 part aged compost, 2 parts native soil, and 1 part perlite or coarse sand for drainage. The drainage part is crucial. Tomatoes sitting in rich, wet soil will give you leaves. Tomatoes in well-draining, moderately fertile soil will give you fruit. I also add something most people skip: sulfur. About 2 tablespoons per planting hole, mixed into the soil 3 weeks before planting. This lowers the pH slightly, and tomatoes produce more fruit in slightly acidic soil around 6.2 to 6.8. You can get a soil test kit for about $12, and it's worth every penny. One more thing about site prep that made a huge difference for me: crop rotation. Never, and I mean never, plant tomatoes where you grew tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, or potatoes the previous year. These are all nightshades, and they share diseases that build up in the soil. I learned this lesson the expensive way when I lost an entire crop to bacterial wilt, my 3rd year gardening. Now I have a 4-year rotation, and I haven't had a major disease problem since. Step 2 is all about planning for maximum fruit production, and this is where technique really matters. Timing is everything with tomatoes. I know you're eager to get them in the ground, but planting too early is one of the fastest ways to end up with all leaves and no fruit. Here's my rule. Soil temperature needs to be consistently above 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Not air temperature, soil temperature. I use a cheap soil thermometer, about $8 at any garden center. Stick it 4 inches into the soil first thing in the morning. When it reads 60 degrees for 3 days straight, you're good to go. In my Zone 7 garden, that's usually around April 15th, but I've had years where I waited until May 1st. Those later planted tomatoes always outproduce the ones I rushed into cold soil. Now here's the planting technique that changed everything for me: deep planting combined with strategic root enhancement. You've probably heard about planting tomatoes deep, but let me show you exactly how to do it for maximum fruit production. First, I remove all the leaves except the top 3 or 4 sets. Yes, it feels wrong, but trust me. Each spot where a leaf was attached can grow roots, and more roots mean more fruit later. I dig my hole about 12 inches deep and 8 inches wide. But here's my secret. I don't just dig straight down. I dig at a 45-degree angle, creating a slanted hole. This allows me to lay the stem in at an angle, which accomplishes 2 things. First, more of the stem gets buried for more root production. Second, the growing tip naturally curves upward toward the sun, reducing transplant shock. Before I place the plant, here's what goes in that hole, and this is critical. First, a handful of bone meal right at the bottom. Not mixed in, just dropped in the bottom where the deepest roots will hit it first. Bone meal is slow-release phosphorus, and phosphorus equals flowers and fruit, not leaves. Then I add my special mixture. 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt mixed with 1 tablespoon of powdered eggshells or agricultural lime. The Epsom salt provides magnesium, which helps with fruit set and prevents blossom end rot later. The calcium from the eggshells is essential for cell wall development in the fruit. I've been using this mixture for 12 years now, ever since an old-timer at the farmer's market shared it with me, and my fruit production went up by at least 30% that very first year. Now I lay that plant in at an angle, with just the top poking out straight. I firm the soil gently. Don't pack it hard or you'll restrict root growth. Then comes another trick I learned from a commercial grower. I create a small well or depression around the plant, about 8 inches in diameter and 2 inches deep. This serves two purposes. It directs water right to the root zone, and it prevents water from splashing soil onto the lower leaves, which is how most diseases get started. Spacing is another place where people set themselves up for leafy plants. Too close together and plants compete for light, growing tall and leafy trying to outreach each other. Too far apart in rich soil, and they have no competition at all, so they just grow and grow. My sweet spot for indeterminate varieties is exactly 24 inches apart in rows 36 inches apart. For determinates, I go 18 inches apart. This is close enough that they'll compete just a little, from pushing them into fruit production mode, but not so close that they're stressed for resources. Now we get to step 3, strategic pruning. To direct energy to fruit, and this is probably the single most important thing you can do to get tons of tomatoes instead of just leaves. I'm going to be honest with you. The first time someone told me to cut healthy growth off my tomato plants, I thought they were crazy. But pruning is what separates the gardeners who get a few tomatoes from those who need wheelbarrows to harvest them all. Let me break this down into exactly what to prune, when to prune it, and how to prune it without damaging your plants. First, let's talk about suckers. Those shoots that grow in the crotch between the main stem and a branch. Every single sucker you leave on the plant is going to become another main stem, complete with its own suckers, and before you know it, you've got a tomato bush instead of a tomato plant. Here's my system. For the first month after planting, I remove every single sucker when they're about 2 inches long. Just pinch them out with your thumb and forefinger early in the morning when the plants are turgid and they snap off clean. If you wait until afternoon when plants are water stressed, they'll tear instead of snapping, and torn wounds are infection highways. After that first month, I get strategic. I keep the sucker just below the first flower cluster. This becomes my backup stem in case something happens to the main stem. Every other sucker gets removed weekly. And I mean weekly. Set a reminder on your phone if you have to. I prune every Saturday morning with my coffee, making it a routine. Miss 2 weeks and those suckers will be thick as your thumb, and removing them will shock the plant. Now here's something most people don't know. Bottom pruning is just as important as sucker removal for fruit production. Once my plants are about 18 inches tall, I remove all leaves below the first fruit cluster. These lower leaves aren't contributing much to photosynthesis anyway since they're shaded, but they're using energy and they're disease magnets. Every leaf touching the ground or close to it is a pathway for soil-borne diseases. I remove them with clean pruning shears, cutting close to, but not into the main stem. Make your cuts in the morning so they heal before evening humidity sets in. By midsummer, my tomato plants have bare stems for the bottom 18 to 24 inches, and you know what? They look a little strange to people used to bushy tomatoes, but they're absolutely loaded with fruit. There's one more type of pruning that really pushes fruit production: topping. About 30 days before your average first frost date, cut off the growing tip of your plants. This stops vertical growth completely and forces all energy into ripening existing fruit. In my Zone 7 garden, I top around September 15th. The first year I did this, I couldn't believe the difference. Tomatoes that had been sitting green for weeks suddenly started turning red. I got an extra 30 pounds of ripe tomatoes that year instead of dealing with boxes of green ones hoping they'd ripen indoors. One warning about pruning: never prune when plants are wet, and never prune diseased plants unless you're removing the diseased portions. Pruning wet plants spreads disease faster than anything else you can do. I learned this the hard way when I tried to stay on my pruning schedule during a rainy week and ended up spreading early blight to every single plant. Now if it's been raining, I wait. Step 4 is watering and fertilizing for fruit, not foliage. And this is where most well-meaning gardeners accidentally push their plants into leaf production. Let's start with watering, because getting this right can double your fruit production. Tomatoes need consistent moisture, emphasis on consistent. The feast or famine approach, where you forget to water for 5 days then flood them, is exactly what causes blossom end rot, cracked fruit, and actually triggers more leaf production as the plant tries to deal with stress. Here's my watering system that works every single time. First, forget overhead watering completely. Getting leaves wet is asking for disease, and diseased plants don't produce fruit. I use drip irrigation now, but for years I used a simpler method that works just as well. I'd take a 2-liter soda bottle, poke 4 small holes in the bottom with a heated nail, and bury it halfway between 2 plants with the neck sticking out. Fill that bottle twice a week, and it slowly releases water right to the root zone. Each plant needs about 1 to 2 gallons per week, depending on size and weather. The key is deep watering that encourages roots to grow down, not frequent shallow watering that keeps roots near the surface. I water twice a week, giving each plant about a gallon each time. During fruit set and development, I increase this slightly to about 1.5 gallons. You can tell if you're watering right by checking the soil 4 inches down. It should feel like a wrung-out sponge, moist but not soggy. Now let's talk fertilizing, because this is where people really mess up and end up with jungle plants. Here's the truth. If you've prepared your soil properly, tomatoes need way less fertilizer than you think. Too much nitrogen, especially, equals leaves. Not enough phosphorus and potassium equals no fruit. My fertilizing schedule is simple but specific. By the way, if you're finding this helpful, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future growing guides. All right, let's keep going with fertilizing. At planting, they get that bone meal and Epsom salt mixture I mentioned. Then nothing for 3 weeks while they establish roots. After 3 weeks, I give them a half-strength feeding of fish emulsion, about 1 tablespoon per gallon instead of the recommended 2. This gives them just enough nitrogen to support healthy growth without going crazy. Once I see the first flowers, I switch completely. No more nitrogen-heavy fertilizers. Instead, I use a tomato-specific fertilizer with an NPK ratio of something like 3:4:6 or 4:7:10. See how the last 2 numbers are higher? That's phosphorus for flowers and fruit, and potassium for disease resistance and fruit quality. I feed every 2 weeks at half strength rather than full strength monthly. This prevents nutrient spikes that trigger vegetative growth. Here's my secret weapon: foliar feeding with Epsom salt solution. Every 2 weeks when I'm doing my regular fertilizing, I also spray the leaves early in the morning with a solution of 1 tablespoon Epsom salt per gallon of water. The magnesium gets absorbed directly through the leaves, and you can literally see the difference in fruit set within days. Just make sure to spray early morning so leaves dry quickly, and never spray once temperatures hit 85 degrees or you'll burn the leaves. Step 5 is about supporting heavy fruit loads. Because once you get these plants producing tons of tomatoes instead of just leaves, you need serious support. Those little cone-shaped tomato cages from the box store, forget about them. They're fine for determinate varieties maybe, but for indeterminate plants loaded with fruit, they're a joke. I've seen them literally pulled out of the ground by the weight of the fruit. Let me tell you what actually works. My favorite method, and the one I use for my 40 plants, is the string trellis system. It's cheap, adjustable, and can handle massive fruit loads. Here's exactly how I build it. First, I put in 8-foot T-posts at the end of each row, driven 2 feet into the ground. Then I run a heavy gauge wire between them at the 6-foot mark. Some people use wood cross beams, but wire is cheaper and lasts longer. Above each plant, I tie gardening twine to that overhead wire. The key is using proper tomato twine. It's usually green or white and won't rot from moisture like regular string. It costs about $15 for a 1,000-foot roll, which is enough for about 50 plants. Now here's the technique for training the plants that took me years to perfect. When the plant is about 12 inches tall, I loosely tie the bottom of the string around the base of the stem, out just above the soil line. Don't tie it tight. You need room for that stem to grow. Then I wrap the string clockwise around the stem as it grows, making one complete wrap for every 8 inches of growth. Always wrap the same direction, and always do it in the morning when the stems are flexible. Try this in the afternoon and you'll snap stems, trust me. As the plant grows, I keep wrapping, and the string supports the entire weight of the plant and fruit. For extra heavy fruit clusters, I use these little clips I found online. Tomato clips they're called, about $20 for 100. They clip onto the string and cradle individual fruit clusters. This prevents the weight of the fruit from breaking branches, which happens more than you'd think when you're getting 6 or 8 large tomatoes on one cluster. If you don't want to do the string method, my second choice is concrete reinforcing wire. It comes in sheets at any home improvement store, about $7 each. Cut it into 6-foot lengths, roll it into a cylinder about 18 inches across, and place it over your plant at planting time. As the plant grows up through it, you can tie branches to the wire. It's not as adjustable as the string method, but it's solid and reusable for years. Now let's move on to step 6, problem-solving common issues that reduce fruiting, because even with perfect technique, things can go wrong. The biggest fruit killer I see is blossom drop, where flowers form but fall off before setting fruit. This usually happens when daytime temperatures are consistently above 90 degrees, or nighttime temperatures stay above 75. The pollen becomes sterile, and flowers just drop. Here's what I do. I spray the flower clusters with a plant hormone spray called Blossom Set, about $8 at any garden center. Spray in the evening when temperatures drop below 80. It doesn't work miracles, but I get about 30% more fruit set during heat waves. The second major problem is poor pollination, especially if you don't have many bees around. Tomatoes are self-pollinating, but they need vibration to release pollen. Commercial growers use special vibrating tools, but here's my free method. I give each plant a firm shake every morning when I'm out checking on them. Just grab the main stem and shake for 2 seconds. You can actually see the pollen falling if you look closely. This simple technique increased my fruit set by at least 20%. Pests are another fruit production killer. Hornworms especially can defoliate a plant in 2 days, and a plant with no leaves isn't making fruit. I check for them every 3 days, looking for their black droppings that look like tiny grenades. When I find them, they go into a bucket of soapy water. But here's a cool trick. If you see a hornworm covered in white cocoons, leave it alone. Those are parasitic wasp eggs, and when they hatch, you'll have an army of beneficial wasps that will control hornworms naturally. Disease prevention is crucial for fruit production. Early blight, late blight, bacterial wilt, any of these will shut down fruit production fast. My prevention system is simple but effective. First, mulch heavily with straw or shredded leaves to prevent soil splash. Second, water at soil level only. Third, spray preventatively with baking soda solution, 1 tablespoon per gallon with a drop of dish soap every week starting in early June. This changes the pH on the leaf surface just enough to prevent fungal spores from germinating. Now for that bonus tip I promised, the calcium Epsom salt fruit booster trick that can literally double your fruit production. This technique came from an old greenhouse grower who'd been growing tomatoes commercially for 40 years. Mix 1 tablespoon of calcium chloride, sold as pool hardener at any pool supply store, about $10 for a 5-pound bag, with 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt in 1 gallon of warm water. Let it dissolve completely, then dilute this concentrate with 9 more gallons of water. Apply 1 quart of this solution to each plant every 2 weeks, starting when the first fruits are golf ball sized. Pour it slowly around the root zone, not on the leaves. The calcium prevents blossom end rot and strengthens cell walls for firmer fruit. The magnesium from the Epsom salt enhances chlorophyll production and helps with fruit set. Together, they create a synergistic effect that pushes the plant into overdrive fruit production. I've tracked my yields for 5 years using this method versus control plants, and the treated plants average 43% more fruit by weight. Not only that, but the fruit stores better and has fewer cracks and deformities. So that's everything you need to know to grow tons of tomatoes instead of just leaves. If this helped you out, please subscribe and ring that bell for notifications. Drop a comment below with your biggest tomato challenge. I read and respond to as many as I can. Happy growing, and I'll see you in the next video.